If anybody really enjoys today's webinar and thinks that it would be good to have me speak as an in-person presenter to one of the groups or clubs they're a part of, we're also happy to do that as well. So without further ado, we'll get started. So to give you guys a little bit of an overview on today's presentation, we're going to do a overview of asset protection and essentially what you should and shouldn't do when protecting your assets. And we'll talk about that both for business owners, but also just for personal assets as well. We'll also give a overview of the financial exemption planning and how you can use it in your asset protection planning. Financial exemption planning are really just assets that are protected by state law, and of course every state is different. So we'll go over the overview of the financial exemption planning and how to use that as well. We'll talk about at what point in your business growth you should consider asset protection. So we'll talk about what you should or shouldn't do before you start a business, what you should or shouldn't do from an asset protection point of view while you're in business, and certainly what you should and shouldn't do after you've been in business for a very long time. We'll also talk about the asset protection implications of owning multiple businesses and the best way to own them as well. We'll talk about why you should both protect your personal and business assets simultaneously and how the two go together. And we'll also talk briefly about when and how to use tenants by the entireties and in what relation. We'll lastly talk about how your business risks affect your asset protection over time. And again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to just email them on the bottom left hand of the screen. You'll see the email address. It's info@assetprotectionattorneys, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. Just to give you guys a little bit of background information, what is asset protection? And a lot of people will give you different definitions of asset protection. The definition that I give for asset protection is the legal process of titling one's both personal and business assets to put them beyond the reach of future potential threats and creditors while simultaneously still enjoying the benefit of those assets. Now, I know that's a long definition, so I'll go through it again. The definition that I give for asset protection is the legal process of titling both your personal and business assets to put them beyond the reach of future potential threats and creditors while simultaneously enjoying the benefit of those assets. And, a lot of people say, do I have enough assets to protect? And I always tell my clients, the less you have, the more you need the protection. And the example that I always like to give is, take one of our NFL football clients who signs for $50 million. Well, if he's sued for $5 million, certainly he's not going to be happy, but he's still going to have $45 million left. Contrast that with, the everyday Joe who maybe has saved up a couple $100,000 in retirement. Well, if he's sued for $1 million, he's going to have a very hard time. It's probably going to be impossible for him to come back from that. So I always tell my clients, the less you have, the more you need the protection. But obviously, someone with $50 million in assets is going to protect themselves different than someone with a couple $100,000 in assets. And that's why you always want to make sure that, there's no one-size-fits-all and, every plan is catered to your needs. Also, sometimes people come to us and they already have an asset protection plan, which I think is great. The more planning you could do, the sooner the better. You're going to be in a much better position. God forbid things happen in the future. What I just recommend is that, it can never hurt to get a second opinion, and certainly, every year you want to have it looked over. So even if someone else did your asset protection plan, you can always have another attorney look it over as well. So all in all, what we do as asset protection attorneys is we help our clients protect any asset they have from any financial threat. So our clients are doctors, business owners, lawyers, financial advisors, people who have been divorced, premarital planning, people who inherited money, really anybody who has anything they don't want to lose. And the type of assets we protect might be as simple as checking, savings, stocks, bonds, brokerage accounts, might be membership interest in LLCs or shares in a corporation, an S corporation or a C corporation. Might even be intellectual property like phone numbers, domain names, real estate, anything of value we help our clients protect. And what we're helping them protect it against is really any financial issues, which in today's day and age obviously is lawsuits, car accidents, breach of contract, slip and fall, short sale or foreclosure deficiencies, divorce, really anything that can take away what you worked your whole life to obtain. So a lot of people say, well, why do I need asset protection? And I put this cartoon in the upper right-hand corner, and it's two attorneys talking. One says, I say sue. The other one says, anyone in particular. And a lot of people laugh when I show them this slide, but unfortunately, it's not funny, and unfortunately, this is the reality. Just like you guys were smart enough today to take time out of your busy schedules, to hopefully spend an hour or so with us and learn some things, well, the attorneys are doing the same thing. Unfortunately, the attorneys are meeting much more often, and they're thinking about who are we going to sue next? Is it going to be the doctors, the drug manufacturers, the business owners, et cetera, et cetera. So just like we're getting together to educate themselves, the attorneys are getting together figuring out who can they sue. There's over 100 million lawsuits every year, and that number is only growing. In today's day and age, people are losing their jobs. The people who are lucky enough to have a job or keep their job are making less and less due to the bad economy. Lawsuits are truly becoming the next biggest business. You can go to pretty much almost any corner and find an attorney who will probably take your case for free on contingency fee basis, and it only costs you about an hour of your time. And then if you win, you probably get tax-free money. So unfortunately, lawsuits are truly becoming the next biggest business. There's a 1 in 4 chance that you will be sued in the next year. So 1 out of every 4 people will be sued in the next 12 months. The average person and company gets sued 5 times over their lifetime. So an individual, on average, gets sued 5 times over their lifetime. And if you have an LLC or an S-Corp, on average, the company gets sued 5 times over their lifetime. Now, I have clients that have never been sued. I have clients that literally get sued 10, 15 times a month. So these are just the average stats. Also, there's a 50% chance of divorce, especially when it's second, third, and fourth marriages. You always want to do some premarital planning. And a lawsuit can cost you tens of thousands of dollars even if you win the case. And what I mean by that is, unfortunately, in today's day and age, they make it so easy to sue somebody, so easy and cheap because you can hire an attorney for free on a contingency fee basis, but they make it so difficult and expensive to defend a case because you're going to have to go pay an attorney tens of thousands of dollars. So unfortunately, even if somebody sues you, and even if you win the case at the end of the day, you're still a loser if you've spent tens of thousands of dollars on legal fees. So what you want to do is you want to put together an asset protection plan so people don't want to come after you. So you want to explain to them that you're not the low-hanging fruit, that there's no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, that even if they beat you, they can't collect against you, so there's no point of suing you in the first place. The trick is really not making the money, it's keeping it. And the challenge that I give to all of my clients is that for every 60 minutes you spend making money, spend 60 seconds thinking about how to protect it. So a lot of people say, well, isn't liability insurance enough? Why do I need an asset protection plan? And, I don't sell insurance, but I tell my clients, buy as much insurance as you can because it's cheap and it helps you sleep at night. But with that being said, don't solely rely on it. Don't forget that insurance companies are here to make a profit. They are for-profit companies. In fact, they make a lot of money. I know at least in Florida, when I drive down 95, the highway, they're the only big buildings with their name on it. So they're doing a great job. And if they paid every single claim, then certainly they wouldn't be profitable and they wouldn't be in business. So just understand that insurance is great, but 70% of lawsuits are not covered by insurance. Also, your coverage may be inadequate. What if you have $300,000 coverage on your car, you get in an accident, and somebody sues you for $1 million? Who do you think comes up with that next $700,000? You. Your insurance company might go bankrupt. Now, if I would have said that to you 5 or 10 years ago, you guys probably would have laughed and kicked me out of the room. My credibility would have been gone. But with that being said, today we have Fortune 500 companies. We have banks going out of business. Who's to say that the insurance companies won't come next? Also, insurance doesn't protect you from other uninsured financial risk and divorce. And actually, I need to change my presentation because there's actually a company now online. You can find them. It's pretty interesting. They offer divorce insurance. So for anybody getting married, you might want to check out that site. I got a good laugh at it. The point is that insurance alone is not the answer. You need your own asset protection plan to supplement your insurance. I call it the belt and suspenders approach. You want as many layers, as many firewalls as possible to help protect you so you could sleep at night knowing, God forbid, if anything happens, what you've worked so hard for your whole life will be safe. 3 maxims of asset protection. Number 1, protect yourself before you have a problem. I don't understand why this is so hard to grasp, but for an asset protection plan to be the most effective, you want to make sure that it's proactive, okay? You don't buy health insurance after you get sick. You don't buy life insurance after somebody dies. And you certainly don't buy car insurance after you get in a car accident. So you shouldn't think that you can go buy asset protection after there's been an issue. Now, it is true that even if you've been sued, that doesn't mean that we necessarily can't help you, but it does mean that your plan will not be as strong, and it does mean that certainly your options will be greatly reduced. So you always want to make sure that you're proactive with your asset protection plan. Next is you want to start with a basic plan and add firewalls as needed. As your education grows, your asset protection should grow. As your personal assets grow, your asset protection should grow. As your business assets grow, your asset protection should grow. Also, most importantly, don't look for one magic bullet or one right plan. Asset protection is not a one-size-fits-all. What might work for you might not work for me and vice versa. Everybody's personal and business assets are different. Everybody's potential threats, liabilities are different. You need an individualized and customized and tailored plan that works for you. Based on what assets you have, how you invest them, where they're located, what your potential liabilities are, etc., your entire plan could change. So certainly don't look for a one-size-fits-all plan. A lot of mistakes to avoid. I'll just briefly today go over the 5 killer mistakes to avoid. Number 1, hiding your assets. Asset protection is not about hiding. Asset protection is not about secrecy. It's about protection. With a good asset protection plan, you should be able to tell any litigator or somebody suing you of where your assets are. They just shouldn't be able to get to them. Now, I'm not saying go stand on top of a mountain and tell everybody what you have and where it is, but we set up every asset protection plan with the understanding that at some point they might have to disclose it. Because if you're asked during deposition what you have, you can't lie, otherwise you could go to jail for perjury. So a good asset protection plan should not rely on hiding your assets. Next, you don't want to title all your assets to straws. So many times people come in my office and they say, "Don't worry, Mr. Presser, I'm being sued, but I gave everything to my brother-in-law or my best friend." And then I look at them and say, what makes you think that your brother-in-law or your best friend actually has less legal problems than you? I've seen cases where they've given their assets away, and the brother-in-law gets sued, and the creditor takes the brother-in-law's assets even though they're really yours. I've seen cases where the client's given the money to the brother-in-law, and the brother-in-law gets a divorce, and his wife takes your assets. So you don't want to title any of your assets to straws. The key is to own nothing but control everything. Also, you don't want to go titling all your assets to your spouse. We see this a lot with the doctor and physician clients. Oh, everything's in my wife's name, so I must be okay. That's not the case. Nobody's immune from a lawsuit. Nobody gets up in the morning expecting to be sued. And who knows, your wife can get in a car accident taking the kids to soccer practice. So you don't want to go titling all your assets to your spouse. You never want to commit any fraudulent transfers, and you certainly don't want to break any laws. Whether you're doing domestic or international asset protection, our law firm does both, you always need to make sure that you're properly reporting all of the entities that you've set up to the government, to the IRS, to the Treasury Department. So nothing you do should be about breaking laws or hiding or secrecy. Just to talk to you guys a little bit about what exemption planning is. Exemptions are assets that are protected by state law. And again, every single state is different. So in Florida, some of the assets that are exempt are your primary residence. It's called your homestead. Your house is protected. In Florida, life insurance is protected. Annuities are protected. Wages could be protected. 401ks. But again, every state is different. And if you go to our website, it's www.assetprotectionattorneys.com. And you look on the top of the page on the left-hand side, you'll see something that's called financial exemption planning or something close to that. If you click on that, we actually have all of the different states. So you can pick whatever state you're in. Just go to www.assetprotectionattorneys.com. On the top, on the left-hand side, you'll see something called financial planning or financial exemption planning, and click on your state, and you'll be able to see what are the exemptions for you. So if you live in New York, it'll be totally different than if you live in Texas. And if you live in Texas, it'll be totally different than if you live in California. But these are different classes of assets that are protected. Now, again, every state is different. You know, in Florida, your life insurance is totally protected, while in Georgia, it's only protected up to $4,000. So you need to make sure and see what the exemptions are for your state. Also, there's different federal versus state exemptions, so we put both of them on there as well. And to kind of discuss how financial exemption planning fits with asset protection is that depending on where you live, if you invested all of your assets, and I'm not telling you to do this from a financial point of view, this you'd have to speak to your financial advisor, but if you put all of your assets into different exemption planning, you'd be totally protected. So, for example, you can have a guy in Florida that's worth $10 million. Maybe he buys a $4 million house. He has $2 million in life insurance, $2 million in annuities, and $2 million in 401ks or some other protected exemption. If he gets sued, nobody can take his assets because they're protected. Now, again, that's protection by using financial exemption planning, not by using legal entities. But certainly take a look at the list and see what is and what isn't protected in your state. To kind of go over some of them, and we'll focus with today's example on Florida, but again, just so you can understand it, definitely go to the website and take a look at what the exemptions are for your state. In Florida, retirement accounts are protected. So whatever money you have in your retirement accounts are protected from lawsuits in Florida. Also, your homestead is protected. So if you're a Florida resident, your primary house is protected. Now, of course, there's some laws. If you're within a municipality, you have to be on less than a half an acre. If you're outside a municipality, you have to be on less than 160 acres. If you get pushed into bankruptcy, you have to have lived there for at least 40 months. So there are some nuances that go with each of these exemptions. But again, if you bought a $5 or a $10 or a $50 million house in Florida, it would be totally protected because it's protected by the homestead exemption. No difference with life insurance and annuities. If you put money into life insurance in Florida, all of the cash value is protected by Florida statute, Florida exemptions. Same thing with the annuities. If you have annuities, they're all protected by Florida law and by Florida exemption planning. Again, I'm using Florida as the example only because that's where we're based out of. We help clients nationwide, but just want to kind of give you an idea. And that's probably why you see so many debtors, move to Florida. Unfortunately, Florida is a great place if you want to owe somebody money. Now again, with everything that we discussed, there's nuances. So for example, whether it's the homestead, whether it's the life insurance, whether it's the annuities, you have to make sure those were all purchased before there was a lawsuit. You can't have a lawsuit today and 6 months from now say, okay, I'm going to buy a home, or I'm going to buy life insurance, or I'm going to buy annuities, because that could be categorized as what's called a fraudulent transfer and or a fraudulent conversion. So again, although all of these different classes of assets are protected by Florida exemption and Florida statute, you still need to make sure that you're proactive. Otherwise, you'll never have the greater deal of protection. And again, I would encourage all of you to go on the website, take a look at your different states, what is and what isn't protected, and certainly if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Asset protection you really want at every stage of the business. So we'll kind of dive into it and talk about new businesses. Why would a new business want asset protection? Well, number one is there's 95% of all businesses end up in failure. So while you might be hot to trot and you might be excited about your business, unfortunately you start a business and the stats are against you. Out of every 100 businesses that are started, 95% of them fail. Now, that doesn't mean that they all go into bankruptcy. Some just close up, et cetera, but there is a 95% business failure rate. Also, when you're in business, there's a lot of things that you'll have to do in regards to personal guarantees. When you want to go rent space, you're going to have to sign a personal guarantee. Anything that you need credit for, even if it's a credit card for the business, you're going to have to sign a personal guarantee. So there's a lot of liability that you pick up, starting a brand new business. So before you start that new business, you want to put together a really good, solid asset protection foundation. Again, you might not need much because you're starting a new business, but you certainly want to have something. Asset protections for young business. I mean, for a young business, you probably have some assets. You might have some money in the bank. You might have equipment, machinery, vehicles, computers, anything like that. And you never know who could sue you. You could have an unhappy client who sues you. You could have a supplier that sues you. You could have a distributor that sues you, a landlord that sues you. You just never know. Nobody gets up in the morning and thinks they're going to be sued. So anybody who has an ongoing business really needs to make sure that they're buttoned up, even more to a degree than starting the new business. Starting the new business, you don't have much to lose. You can always just start over again. But when you have a young business that's been around for a long time, the first few years of a business is when you always put the most time, money, and energy into it. So certainly you don't want to have to fold up. You want to make sure that your business is protected. Also, you want to have asset protection, of course, probably the most importantly, for an experienced business, because the longer you've been around, the higher the chances that you have some sort of liability. Now, again, who knows if it's a client, if it's a landlord, if it's a supplier, a customer, a distributor. You never know, but the longer you've been around, the more years you've been around, unfortunately, the bigger chance of a lawsuit. Also, the bigger chances that you have more assets. A business that has been around, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, more likely has built up more assets over time than a company that's been open for about 2 years. And again, assets to a business are always different. Sometimes it's hard assets like vehicles or equipment or machinery. A lot of times an assets might be accounts receivables, money owed to the business. A lot of other times it's not accounts receivables, it's not equipment or machinery, but it might be intellectual property. So it might be a patent or a trademark. It might even be a phone number or a domain. Think about it. What would happen if your phone number ran to the competitor? What would happen if somebody went to your website and the competitor's website came up? So you definitely want to make sure that at every stage of the business you're protected, whether you're starting a new business, whether you've been around for a little bit of time, or if you've been around forever. You always want to have a solid foundation and a solid backbone for your asset protection plan. So a lot of people own more than one business, and I want to talk briefly about how to title each one of the businesses. Anytime you own more than one business, I don't care how closely related they are, they should always be in different entities. I'll give you an example. We had a client, and he had a very successful restaurant. He was making about $1 million a year. He then opened up a second restaurant, and that was very successful, and he made another $1 million a year. Well, unfortunately, when he opened up his third restaurant, it did terrible. It was a bad location, and he had so many liabilities that the creditors not only went after that restaurant, they went after the first two successful restaurants because they were all owned by the same company, and that guy is now out of business. So anytime you have a different type of business, no matter how similarly related it is, you always want to set up a different entity. And there's a lot of different entities that you can choose. There's the LLC, the S Corp, the C Corp, etc. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Also, you want to have other entities own your business. So, for example, it might not, let's say you have one business, or let's say you own multiple businesses. It might not just be enough to set up multiple LLCs or multiple S Corps or multiple C Corps, because at the end of the day, you still own all those LLCs, or you still own all those S Corps, or you still own all those C Corps. Okay? So you might want to set up other entities to actually own your businesses. So, for example, you might want to set up a limited partnership to own the LLC. You might want to set up a limited partnership to own the C Corp. You might want to set up a trust to own the S Corp. So there's so many different layers and firewalls that you can put on it. And obviously, the more layers of protection you have, the more difficult and expensive, if not impossible, it's going to be for any potential creditor to come after you. See, the goal with asset protection is that if it's a frivolous lawsuit, you don't want to pay anything. That's what I tell my clients. But if it's a legitimate claim, if you can pay 10, 15, 20 cents on the dollar, then we feel like we've done our job correctly. Asset protection isn't to say you'll never pay a claim. Okay, it's just to say that, hey, you're going to pay a far less of a claim than you would have paid if you didn't have asset protection. I have clients who have gotten $3 million judgments against them. Well, they might not want the judgment against them their entire life, so they might settle the case for $300,000 or $400,000. So they're still writing checks, but they're saving millions and millions of dollars. So just keep that in mind. You're not going to be able to save every penny. Sometimes crumbs do fall through the cracks. Also, there's a lot of good jurisdictions to incorporate in: Florida, Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada, Alaska. I could go on, but it really depends on what type of business you have. Where are you going to be operating it from? Is it an online business? Is it a retail store? How many different states will you be in, et cetera, et cetera? Every state constitutes doing business in different ways. For example, in some states, you can own a piece of real estate, let's just call it a vacation home, and they don't consider that doing business, which means you can set up an entity in whatever the best asset protection jurisdiction is to own that piece of real estate. Well, in other states, if you own a piece of real estate, they do constitute it owning business. So regardless of where you set up the entity to own the piece of real estate, you potentially might also have to set up another entity or register they call it a foreign entity to do business in that state. So again, everything's going to depend on what type of business you have, how you're operating it, where you're going to operate it, if it's online, if it's retail, et cetera, et cetera. Again, you just want to keep in mind that there's no one-size-fits-all. Also, I want to talk to you guys about the advantages of protecting both personal and business assets simultaneously. We refer to this as both inside-out and outside-in protection. The reason is because so many people say, you know what, I want to set up a corporation because I want to make sure that, God forbid, my business is sued, that nobody can come after my personal assets. And, when people set up a corporation, that's what happens. They operate as the corporation. Let's just call it an S-Corp, because I know a lot of people have S-Corps, and they're operating as the S-Corp. And God forbid if there's any liability, the party that's going to be sued is the S-Corp. Now, of course, there's times where a creditor can try and pierce the corporate veil and come after you personally, but the whole point of setting up a company is to have that corporate layer of protection. You're protecting your personal assets from business debts and liabilities. And again, for the most time, that works. But people fail to look at it the other way around. How your personal assets and liabilities can affect your business and vice versa. Let's think about it this way. Somebody sets up an S-Corp and they sell hats. That's their business. Somebody comes in to buy a hat, they slip and fall, and they sue the business. Well, okay, they're suing the business. They can't go after the person's personal assets. However, the person's personal asset, and usually the person's largest and most valuable personal asset, is the business. Because business owners tend to put a lot of money into their business. They tend to put a lot of time into the business. And even when they're making money, to reinvest it in the business. So they might not even have that many personal assets. Well, what happens if you lost your business? If you lost your business, you would lose your cash flow. And people never feel to think about this. Let me give you an example. You have the S-Corp, you're selling hats. But this time, you don't get sued as any result of your store. You get sued personally. Maybe you got in a car accident. Maybe you had a short sale or foreclosure deficiency. Maybe you had a breach of contract. Maybe you had an issue with your landlord or tenant. But somebody sues you personally. Well, if you have $100,000 in the bank and they win, and they're suing you for $100,000, they can take the $100,000. Let's say they don't have $100,000 in the bank, but they have $100,000 in stock. So they bought some Apple stock and some Facebook stock and some Best Buy stock. Well, the creditor can take, if they beat you in the lawsuit, can take the $100,000 in stock. There's absolutely no difference in the S corporation. If somebody's suing you personally and you don't have that money in the bank to fulfill the judgment, and you don't have that stock or the real estate or whatever it is to fulfill the judgment, a creditor can actually go after your shares in your S corp. That is considered an asset. And you guys all know that if somebody gets the shares in your S-Corp and they own the majority, then they can pretty much do anything they want. They can hire, fire, liquidate the bank account, bankrupt the company, literally have full power to your business, and now your cash flow is gone. So anybody who's operating their business as an S-Corp, you definitely want to check that out because there's a lot more protective ways that you can do so to protect your business from any personal liabilities and threats and creditors. Tenants by entireties is really just a form of ownership. To kind of explain it to you briefly, tenants by entirety exists in about 25 different states, and it's only for a married living couple. So what I mean by that is if there's a divorce, you can't use tenants by entirety. If there's a death, you can't use tenants by entirety. You can only use tenants by entirety if it's a married living couple, and it exists in about 25 different states. Now, out of all those states, I'm sure you guys can guess which one is the best state: Florida. And the reason why Florida is the best state is that in a lot of the other states that let you own things tenants by entirety, they only let you own real estate tenants by entirety. In Florida, you can pretty much own anything tenants by entirety. You can own real estate, you can own a bank account, you can own a business, shares in a corporation, et cetera, et cetera. And essentially what tenants by entirety states is that the assets of both spouses are not subject to the creditors of one spouse. So let me give you an example. I'll give you an example using money, but understand it doesn't have to be money. It could be anything. Husband has $50,000 in his account. Wife has $50,000 in her account. If the husband sued, they could take every penny. If the wife sued, they could take every penny. If the husband would have took his $50,000 and the wife would have took her $50,000 and put it in one joint account and labeled it tenants by entirety, well, if the husband sued, they can't take a penny. If the wife sued, they can't take a penny. The only way they would potentially be able to go after that money is if both the husband and the wife were sued. So tenants by entirety is great. Provides you with a nice layer of protection. It's certainly not an end-all, be-all, but it doesn't cost you anything. Maybe an hour of the lawyer's time for him to tell you what to do. With that being said, there's certain things that should be titled tenants by entirety and certain things that shouldn't be titled tenants by entirety. Nothing wrong with titling a business, whether it's an LLC or an S-Corp, tenants by entirety. That'll always add a layer of protection. Nothing wrong with titling other business accounts like limited partnerships or things of that nature tenants by entirety. That'll always add added protection. No problem in titling bank accounts tenants by entirety. Again, will always add extra protection. Where you want to be aware of not titling things tenants by entirety are with liability producing assets. So for example, you don't want to put cars, boats, planes in tenants by entirety names. And the reason and rationale is that let's say there's a car accident. Well, if there's ever a car accident, there's two parties that could be sued. The person driving and also the person who owns the car. So if you're driving the car, you're going to get sued as the driver. But if your car is owned tenants by entirety, that means they can go after both you and your wife since you're both the owners, which means they can go after any other tenants by entirety assets that you have. So you never want to title a boat, a car tenants by entirety because those are the liability producing assets. To cover briefly, business risks and asset protection over time, basic asset protection techniques for young businesses. Again, I don't care how small of a business you are, form an entity. Whether it's the S-Corp, whether it's the LLC, whether it's the trust, whether it's the limited partnership, whether it's the C-Corp, we'll help you find the best entity structure for you, but make sure you form one. I knew somebody who essentially, she was in her 70s or 80s, and she went into business. She started a doll company, and she sold the dolls at the local flea market. And she said, well, why do I need a business? I'm just starting. It's very small. Well, one of the dolls poked the eye out on a child, and she was sued, and literally was sued for millions and millions of dollars. Now, if she was operating as an S-Corp or an LLC or some other business entity, rather than a sole proprietor in her personal name, she would have been protected. In regards to when to increase firewalls, again, as your business grows, let your asset protection grow. As your personal assets grow, let your asset protection grow. As your education and understanding grows, let your asset protection grow. But don't try and do everything all at once. The key to asset protection is to make sure you understand everything that you do. It's to go to bed at night knowing that, God forbid anything happens, you're going to be fine the next day. So don't try and do too much. Also, I just want to touch very briefly on international asset protection. We use international asset protection when domestic asset protection is simply not enough. There's no black and white line of when to do it. I have clients who only have a couple $100,000 in assets, and they set up international entities. I have clients who have $1 million in assets who don't set up international entities because they might be in their late 80s, they don't drive, they don't work, they don't own real estate. They really have as close to no liability as possible. But if you have at least, $400,000 or $500,000 in liquid assets, you should really consider international asset protection. Also, if you have the type of business where you constantly have a lot of cash in your business, so it's one thing if money comes in and then the money goes out for expenses, that's fine. But if you have a business that keeps, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash in your business, you also wanted to also consider an international asset protection entity for that as well. And certainly we can talk to you about that.